Hello, welcome everybody. I'm Jean Gross, and I'm delighted to be chairing this session on grit, character and resilience, how social emotional skills support all sorts of good outcomes for children and young people. And my reflection to start with is that each and every one of us has had to exercise a considerable character, grit and resilience. And I am now getting some. Yeah, I've stopped it now. Sorry, everybody. I'll go back to Zoom. You've got two of me. Now you've got one of you. Hopefully, no more delay. So we've all had to use grit and resilience, and no more so than children and young people in our schools. And so as a result, there's been an absolute boom in the interest in social emotional learning in children's well-being and their mental health, hasn't there? But to me, and that's great, but to me, some of it has been a little bit grabbing a resource here and doing a little thing here. Let's do a bit of mindfulness. Let's do something on emotion recognition. All very important, but it has sometimes lacked any sort of systematizing framework into which to put this work, and some confusion between what well-being means, what mental health means, and how that relates to social emotional skills. What I think COVID has also highlighted for me is that those schools which were proactive and already had in place some sort of systematic framework for working on children's social emotional skills and competencies were in a good place. But the ones that weren't have had to go into reactive mode. And reactive is not always the most helpful way to develop this core sort of learning for children. But nevertheless, it is so welcome to see the interest that there is. And today's a really good opportunity for us all to come together, and we really want to have an engaging and informative and a solution-focused discussion about where we are now in this area and where we need to go next. So we've chosen a range of speakers who can bring different and complementary perspectives to this afternoon. Perspectives from national policy, perspectives from evidence and research, and the very important local and frontline perspectives. What we're going to do is hear from 4 different experts. First, and they're smiling at the word experts, but they are all absolute experts and wonderful, brilliant, inspirational people. I won't introduce them all now. I'm going to introduce each one just before they talk to us. Each of them is going to talk for 5 or 8 minutes about some aspect of this area that pertains to their own work or really they're passionate about. When we've been through all 4, then we're going to open it up for your comments and your questions and discussions. So please keep that going as you go along. First of all, I'd like to introduce Dr. Aleisha Clarke. Aleisha's the head of what works in child mental health and wellbeing at the Early Intervention Foundation. She's got extensive research experience of the development, the implementation and the evaluation of evidence-based social emotional, I'm going to say CEL for short because it saves a lot of words, evidence-based CEL interventions, and she was one of the co-authors of last year's guidance on CEL in primary schools that came out from the Early Intervention Foundation and the Education Endowment Foundation. So can I turn over to you now, Aleisha, for you to join us?
Thanks, Jean. So I'm going to start by looking at, I suppose, the definition of social emotional learning and really what do we mean by social emotional skills. So I suppose we often use terms such as conflict resolution, character education, bullying prevention, positive youth development. There's no end to the variety of terms that are out there to describe the work that's been done in both the school and the out of school setting to support children and young people's mental health and well-being. But really, I suppose over the last decade, the term social and emotional learning, or as Jean said, CEL, has served as an umbrella framework to describe the range of prevention and promotion efforts across the education and youth sector. So I'll just very quickly look at what we mean by CEL. So in general, it has 3 core domains. The first domain is the social domain, and this really is around developing children and young people's relationship skills, their ability to form and maintain friendships, to cooperate with each other, and to resolve conflicts. We then have an emotional domain, and this is really around recognizing, articulating, managing our emotions, being able to understand the emotions and perspective of others, and to cope with frustrations and stress. And our third core domain in relation to these skills is our cognitive domain, often referred to as metacognition. So this is centered around being able to focus and pay attention, being able to set and achieve goals, to plan and organize, and to problem solve. So just to look at what's the evidence on the impact of these skills in relation to attainment, mental health, and behaviour. Really, decades of research provides quite solid evidence that social, emotional, and cognitive development are intertwined, and that together they influence school and life outcomes. So if you take correlational studies, they show us that social and emotional skills are related to positive life outcomes up to 30 and 40 years later. So just to give you an example, in 2015, Alyssa Goodman and colleagues conducted a piece of research on behalf of EIF, where they looked at the long-term associations between social and emotional skills in childhood, this was at the age of 10, and their association with adult outcomes at the age of 42. And this was using the British cohort data. And what they found was that good social skills were predictors of life satisfaction and well-being, labour market success, and good health. Good emotional skills were especially important for outcomes relating to mental health and well-being in adult life. Then if you take meta-analysis studies, these give us a very good sense of the effects that are generated from interventions which are designed to enhance children and young people's social, emotional, and behavioural outcomes. So quite a number of meta-analyses have been published in the last 10 years, and they have really demonstrated the impact of high quality, well implemented interventions. And that's quite an important point on implementation, which I can come back to. But they have shown us that interventions designed to enhance social emotional skills have a positive impact on social emotional skills, behaviour, academic performance, as well as reducing conduct problems and reducing levels of emotional distress. So now in relation to what do we know about what works? So when we look at the large number of trials that are out there to examine the impact of these interventions on enhancing social and emotional and behavioural outcomes, we see, there's quite a vast array that show positive effects. However, there are others that show null effects or quite small effects. So a major part of the work that we do at the Early Intervention Foundation is trying to make sense of these trials and to translate this into something that's quite meaningful and hopefully quite practical for teachers. So as part of this work, last year we developed guidance with quite a few members of the panel for teachers in primary school on social emotional learning. So as part of this guidance, we made a series of recommendations on how to integrate practices into your everyday teaching. We also made recommendations on the need for evidence-based programs and how to select and implement evidence-based programs. We made recommendations on the adoption of a whole school approach and the need for high quality implementation. As part of this guidance, we were able to identify some of the real characteristics of effective programs. And just to give you an example of some, we've seen that the most effective programs generally teach children and young people how to apply these skills into everyday life. So it's not just a matter of teaching a particular skill, but actually the application of that into their everyday life and interactions with others. They tend to use diverse teaching methods, and really the children are engaged in activity-based learning. We also see that the most effective programs tend to provide high-quality staff development and support, and that they're grounded in strong theories of child development. I think an important point to make, though, is that adopting programs with evidence of impact is not a guarantee for success. And I think we do need to do more work around supporting the high-quality implementation of evidence-based programs and supporting teachers and schools to embed these programs within a whole school approach so that these skills are being reinforced through the school ethos and environment. And now to my final core question, I suppose, is it's really around looking at social emotional learning and why these skills are more important than ever given the current context of COVID-19. So there's been a lot of speculation about the possible impact of COVID-19 on children's mental health. And now we're starting to see the data come through to help us understand actual impact. So we've recently published an evidence brief on adolescent mental health, which looked at the prevalence of adolescent mental disorders. And as part of that, we examined some of the data that was gathered during lockdown. And really the results from this, as Joe has mentioned already this morning, show that children and young people's mental health has deteriorated over the last 3 years, with a 5 percentage point increase in probable mental disorders since 2017. So 1 in 6 children and young people aged between 5 and 16 were identified in June as having a probable mental disorder. So if you think of that in terms of a class of 30, that's 5 children in every class of 30. So the figures really are quite stark. So I think the disruption to schools and daily lives for children and young people, it's underscored and highlighted that skills such as resilience, relationship skills, emotional regulation, they're not nice to haves in education, but rather they're foundational to learning and productivity. And, I don't want to overclaim CEL, but, I'm certainly not saying that CEL will resolve all of the needs of education, but it certainly should be a key component in terms of helping to address children's mental health and well-being so that they are able to learn. Children really need to be taught to recognise, to articulate and to manage their emotions that they may experience as a result of the pandemic. And I think we can do more as the research community to try and support parents and teachers to work better together in trying to reinforce these skills across the school setting and in the home environment. And two final points from me. Just to say, I think, whilst thinking about children's needs in this pandemic, I think it's important that we also address teachers' needs. The well-being of teachers, it's not a new concern, but COVID-19, I think, has underscored and highlighted the need to support teachers' well-being as part of the work that we do to support children and young people's mental health. And a final point, I think it's really important that we build partnerships with the out-of-school setting. I think the education sector, no doubt, it has its hands full in terms of catching up after lockdown. And I do believe that the out-of-school setting has a really important role to play in supporting and reinforcing these essential skills, which contribute to positive mental health and well-being.
Thank you so much, Aleisha. Really welcome your emphasis on implementation and how we can help people do this well. And I know Robin will probably pick up on that from the point of view of his research on that later. I also just wanted to pick up on the very interesting finding that in some ways, the lockdown period of COVID, the first one, helped some secondary pupils. They felt less anxious when they were out of some of the pressures of schools, which perhaps weren't so good at fostering a sense of belonging and so on. So there isn't just one thing, is there? There's a nuanced picture here of what COVID has done for different groups of children, but for all of them, I'm quite sure that the ones that are bouncing back quickest and will bounce back are those with good social emotional skills. So thank you again, Aleisha. We'll come back to you later. Now, Emma, might I introduce Emma Lewis? Emma's the inspirational head of Heathmere Primary School in Wandsworth, and she's a really keen advocate of the important role that primary schools should play in this field. She sat on the advisory panel last year for the EIF guidance. I met her then and learned a great deal from her, so I'm really looking forward to hearing what it feels like on the ground in your school in relation to COVID, but also what you've always done, the day job that you do so well in developing children's CEL.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction, Jean, and thank you, Aleisha. That was really interesting, as ever, to listen to you. So, yes, thank you for the introduction. My name's Emma Lewis, and I'm the head teacher at Heathmere Primary School. We're situated in the heart of the Alton Estate in Roehampton in southwest London. The Alton Estate, when it was built, was one of the largest council estates in Europe and serves a population of 13,000 people with 3,600 properties on the estate. So many of our children live in high-rise housing, but we have beautiful views over Richmond Park. Over the 50% of the children are classified as disadvantaged. And 10% of the children across the school have been on a child protection plan at some point already in their lives. Numbers of children here with special needs are high. And if I give you an example, in 2020, from my year 6 cohort of 41 children, we had 5 children who transitioned into specialist provision. In January 2013, I took over at Heathmere, and the school at the time was requiring improvement, and it did require improvement. Never has there been a more appropriate title for a school. And I spent all day, every day, standing in corridors and de-escalating children. I've held onto furniture to stop it being thrown. I've stood against doors while children crash against them, and I've watched every single display down the whole corridor be torn to shreds time after time again. And back in 2013, the implementation of strong and consistent behaviour policy actually absorbed the large majority of presenting needs. And we also at that point instilled the values and created and instilled the values which still stand at Heathmere, which were respect, resilience, and high expectations. And I think about this word resilience, which I feel has come to the fore maybe in the last 5-6 years, but actually it was something that way back when we realised that our children here in Roehampton, they really were going to have to learn this skill of resilience long before I really understood the explicit value in social and emotional learning. And as time went on, while we had a behaviour policy that did support the large majority of presenting needs, but we still wanted to do more, and we needed to do more. Secondary schools were telling us that children from Heathmere were struggling to manage their emotions. And I repeatedly watched children who had been held onto at primary school get permanently excluded at secondary school. And all these things would come and go, and I would see all of these opportunities. And when you work in a school such as Heathmere, you get offered a lot. You get offered, we tick a lot of boxes. We would get offered lots of opportunities to do different programs, visiting speakers, different events. But I've always had a philosophy of if it doesn't have an impact, we don't do it. And I think, as Aleisha alluded to at the start, there can be lots of grabbing at a resource here, and things can really lack a systemized approach. And so we really tried to filter out and find things which were going to be impactful for our children. And 3 years ago, we made a decision to implement a structured approach to teaching social and emotional learning. We looked at the options and we adopted a program called Paths, promoting alternative thinking strategies. And so every Friday afternoon at Heathmere, across the school, we explicitly teach social and emotional learning. And there are 2 significant angles really where we see an impact. And the first is in the children's language and their language skills. Children, at a very sort of simplistic level, children are taught the language of comfortable and uncomfortable feelings, with the word private that sits in between them. And they are very, very explicitly taught what these words mean. And within this language, children are taught that feelings are okay. All feelings are okay. And we all have all of these emotions. It is okay to be angry. It's a feeling that we all experience. It's okay to be angry, but it's not okay to then wallop someone because we're angry. And so because the children are explicitly taught this language, they are all able to use this to say how they're feeling. And at its most powerful, I recall a year 5 child who sat in my office a couple of years ago, and she said to me, "Miss Lewis, something has happened that has made me feel uncomfortable." I doubt she would have been able to start that conversation had we not previously explicitly taught her this language. And actually only yesterday, as I was going through my speech, what I was going to say last night, and only yesterday something happened that I thought was just so relevant. I was out on playground duty, and I intervened with some year 3 children on the playground. And there was a child who looked at me and she said, he did it because he was angry. I could tell he was angry because of how his face looked. Now, that child that spoke to me has got special needs. And these 2 sentences from her were totally unprompted, to the point that actually I don't think she has ever initiated a conversation with me before. But because we have this shared language at Heathmere, the children are able to explain what's happening. We then proceeded to agree that it was okay that he was angry, but that he shouldn't have stamped on the cricket bat because he was feeling angry. And that group of year 3 children would have received the same response from whichever adult across the school had intervened. And teaching explicit social emotional learning skills teaches children explicit strategies to manage their uncomfortable feelings. So right from nursery, I bought a little prop, right from nursery, children are taught to do turtle, where they are taught to take themselves, here we go, hold on, it's live. There's the puppet, and they are taught to take themselves into their shell. So at its very simplest form, the children are taught to do this. And they take themselves into their shell until they're ready to come out. And a year 1 teacher last year talked to me about a girl in her class, and she said she often finds it difficult to deal with feelings of unhappiness and used to resort to crying instead of talking about it. Now, when she's feeling unhappy, she asks if she can have a few minutes by herself, go into her shell and think about her feelings. Once she has completed this, she will then talk openly as to why she's feeling that way. And as the children get older, obviously the turtle strategy evolves into stop, think, make a plan and go. And so as COVID hit back in March 2020, what did all of this mean for us here at Heathmere? The children at Heathmere were devastated back in March when school closed to the majority of them. And remote learning was such a challenge for so many of our families. But I really believe that because the children already received such a strong diet of resilience and social emotional learning at Heathmere, they coped much better than I certainly would have believed. And the full return in September was actually pretty seamless. And children felt like they had the skills to cope with what was happening. As Jean said, we didn't need to be reactive to the situation. And so 8 years of headship in a challenging school has obviously taught me many things. And as we work with children, we must understand that they cannot make decisions and they cannot learn if they are not feeling emotionally calm and emotionally secure. And by explicitly teaching them social emotional skills, children will come to learn that it's okay to have these emotions that make them feel uncomfortable. And children can be taught. They can be explicitly taught how to share how they're feeling and why. And ultimately, this will give them the resilience that they require to get through the challenges that they will be faced with. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Emma. Nobody will ever forget Turtle, and nor will I forget the children you told us about and the gains they made in their lives. I also just reflected, if we were able now, through the magic of technology, to poll every teacher in the country and say, is it okay for children to be angry in school? I think we'd guess that most of them say, no, it's not okay to be angry. And, there's just that simple message. All feelings are legitimate. It's what you do with them that counts, but all feelings are legitimate. Is a brilliant one. We just need to get that across, don't we? So thank you again. And I now turn to Bethia. Bethia is the Chief Executive, extremely important person, of the Centre for Youth Impact. She's been with it since its set up in 2014. And before that, she worked in a range of really interesting roles at the Dartington Social Research Unit. Many of us know and love Dartington. The Young Foundation, the National Youth Agency, and even NIACE, the National Institute of Adult Continuing Education, which I remember. Worked in a variety of policy and research roles, and she's also worked in FE and HE as a teacher and trainer, and she's only 21. How did she do it? Over to you, Bethia.
That's my favourite ever introduction, Jean. Thank you. I'm going to remember that one. It's delightful. Thank you. And really pleased to be here talking about this subject today, particularly because of the importance of thinking about this across all the domains of young people's lives. So family and home, of course, school, and also, as both Aleisha and Emma mentioned, what happens out of school as well for young people. So that's the bit that I'm going to focus on. So my work has focused just on the out of school settings for young people for about the last 15 years. And a lot of that has been thinking about evaluation, improvement, and what those types of services, what that type of provision aims to do with and for young people, which of course is almost entirely around social emotional learning. So the worlds start to come together. So those of you who are familiar with out of school youth work, youth provision and youth services will know that there is much debate about outcomes in youth services. So what they are, what they should be, whether they should be measured, even whether they can be measured, who determines those outcomes, who owns those outcomes, whether you can define them in advance or whether they just emerge over time. And in some ways, that debate is very welcome and very useful. It can be a distraction sometimes, but long live that debate, I say. But where there is no debate, I don't think, is about the purpose of youth services. And this is taken from the recent youth work curriculum produced by National Youth Agency. The purpose is to engaging with young people to facilitate their personal, social and educational development and enable them to gain a voice, influence and place in society. So of course social emotional learning underpins and runs through this entirely, but it also reminds us that it can't be the preserve of any one sector or any one bit of or any one domain of young people's lives. This is about young people's place and role in society, not just at home or at school or at work in the future. And we're not great, by the way, in the youth sector at thinking about how young people cross over and live different parts of their lives in other places. I don't want to claim that we are. So at the Centre for Youth Impact, we think of social emotional learning, and it was really helpful to hear Aleisha talking about those definitions. And we think in those ways too, about social emotional learning as a process that happens in a setting, and that focuses on domains of skills, which some people call outcomes, that transfer into other areas of young people's lives. So that reduction of all of this to just talking about outcomes, I think, is unhelpful. So we think of social emotional learning as something that happens both in the moment, but is also a longer term experience and something that young people take with them into different areas of their lives and indeed, of course, into adulthood. It's also an interaction between staff practices, so what teachers or youth workers or group leaders or mentors, whoever they are, those staff practices and the feelings and experiences of young people and how they behave as a result. So again, it's not a static thing that you can point at, it is a process and an interaction between those things. So as a result, one of the things that we focused on particularly is the connection between quality practice and outcomes. That feels absolutely fundamental to me, and in the context of this conversation we're having today, it's also fundamental to how we think about and use evidence. The evidencing of outcomes and thinking about and understanding and improving quality are not two separate things. They coexist and they must coexist. So at the Centre for Youth Impact, we have an outcomes framework, just like about 120 other people across the globe who produced one that just focuses on social emotional learning. It's got in it responsibility, empathy, problem solving, initiative, team working and emotion management. So it's no different or no more special than any other outcomes framework. And we deliberately didn't pick particular words that were different to everybody else's, because then you get into debate about, what's grit versus bounce back ability and so on, which feels entirely unhelpful. And partly we chose words that are the same as everyone else's words because the research is strong on this. As Aleisha said, there isn't much sense in reinventing the wheel here. But rather than just focusing on those words as outcomes, we refer to them as domains of skills, but also the opportunities that young people need to develop those skills. So they are intentional opportunities to develop and practice specific skills. So yes, the emphasis is on children, young people developing and practicing those skills, but the emphasis is also on the adults in their lives to create and provide those intentional opportunities for them. And this is because we can't separate out the outcomes that young people experience, social emotional learning outcomes, from the context in which they are living and they're learning. So what do we think is the process that happens in social emotional learning in a setting? We think it's when young people feel safe and supported. We think it's when they feel interested and challenged, and when they are offered opportunities to consciously and actively reflect on information and its meaning. And those two first things about feeling safe and supported and feeling interested and challenged, they're about meeting young people where they're at. So you'll hear that phrase a lot in youth work. We meet young people where they are. It's not specific to youth work, of course, it's used all over the place. And that's sometimes a slightly unwoolly phrase that doesn't really pin things down. But this idea of it's very specifically about understanding young people's social and emotional history. So what are they bringing in to a setting, an environment or a space with you? This might include, and Emma talked a bit about something, it might include things around chronic stress and trauma, but it also includes lots of assets. But it's really deeply understanding what they bring in. It's also understanding the beliefs about themselves and the world, because these are critically important for young people. And this is about knowing young people really deeply, and that's about building trusting relationships with them. So it's critical then that we understand that interrelationship between staff practices, what adults do, between young people's experiences, so what do they experience in that setting, in the moment, young people's social and emotional skills, the mental skill that they are starting to develop, and then their behaviours, how they're putting that into practice. And again, Emma talked about many of those things very clearly and how they play out in a school. So we've been working on trying to pull this, what can be quite an unhelpful obsession about demonstrating outcomes towards a much richer understanding of the relationship between quality and outcomes, but also this as a much richer process that happens in settings. And those settings don't have to be physical, of course, they can be virtual. We know that at the moment. So what does all this mean for evidence then? For us, this means that evidence has to be embedded in practice. It lives in the day-to-day, it lives in the relationships that we have as adults with one another, and also with children and young people. It becomes much less a question of, can I demonstrate my value to a funder? And much more about, am I doing the best I can to create safe, engaging spaces for all young people all the time? Because this is an equity question as well. In my experience, that question of, can I demonstrate my value to a funder, that's most likely to be, and it's funny you should talk about all feelings being valid, that's most likely to coexist with feelings of anxiety, with resentment, with frustration. Questions about, am I doing the best I can to create this safe, engaging environment for all young people all the time? In my experience, that's more likely to connect with practitioners' passion, the reason for doing what they're doing, and their belief in their role. And I noted as well when Paul Ranchandi was speaking this morning in one of the sessions, he was talking about the importance of how we value different forms of evidence and how we interpret it. And I think the closer we can integrate evidence into practice really supports that. So the last thing I want to say is just about how this evidence is then organised to support it being put into practice. And I think this is the case across schools and youth services, but youth services have traditionally felt themselves being much further away from this evidence base and the use of it. I think thinking about the evidence being much more rooted in practice and being based on more granular practice, so the interactions that adults and young people have with one another, I think this suggests that that's more important than just focusing on programmes or interventions. And certainly in the outer school space, the kind of work that happens is not usually programmes or interventions. It's bundles of practices and approaches that are highly tailored, highly localised. There isn't a sense of implementing evidence-based practices like that. It also suggests, I think, that evidence needs to support real-time and not post-hoc reflection and action. And I think there are some really exciting developments at the moment that are more congruous with that much more responsive and adaptive youth sector practice. So the idea of core components, which are the units of analysis, if you like, within evaluation, and we hypothesise will determine or mediate impact. So the things that sit, they're the core components, the main bits of the kind of practice provision that we offer. Common theories of change, I think, are another exciting development. I really welcome a focus on where we are similar rather than where we are all unique. In my experience, most quality practice is largely the same, and so it should be, because we know that there are consistent and effective things that can be offered. And the other thing, which links directly to turtles, is kernels. So it's the teeny tiny bits of practice that can be done in a matter of minutes. And evidence suggests that there's some work at Harvard, the EASL lab there, that it's better to empower practitioners, teachers and youth workers to embed and implement kernels throughout their practice, rather than to try to deliver one evidence-based programme at a particular time of the week, for example. It's cheaper, and evidence suggests it may well be more effective. And from a youth sector perspective, that's absolutely the way to align evidence and congruence with practice.
Thank you so much, Bethia. You've taken us into that really interesting territory of practices versus programs. You've also made me reflect on the advantages of your very interesting outcomes framework, which of course is allowed to have outcomes that are social and emotional, whereas schools struggle with that because they have outcomes imposed on them which are far from that territory. Even though CEL will help them deliver the academic outcomes, the CEL outcomes are not, they're not their framework. So in some ways, we should be learning absolutely from the youth sector. On now, finally, to Robin. Professor Robin Banerjee is Professor of Developmental Psychology at the University of Sussex, and without doubt one of the absolute leading lights in research and science in CEL in the UK. He leads a research lab that's investigating children's social emotional functioning, and he also works closely with policy makers. I know he's done a lot with the Welsh Government. I wish he had the opportunity to do a lot with the English Government. He's very grounded in his work with schools and settings, not just schools, but a range of settings for children. And I know his contribution today will be invaluable. Over to you, Robin.
Thank you so much. It's absolutely lovely to be here. And I've got to say, I was saying to this group before, being the last one to speak is really, really hard because, well, Jean, Emma, Bethia, Aleisha, you've done an absolutely amazing job of bringing out so many powerful issues. And I want to get stuck into the discussion with all of you and hear questions from the people watching as well. But I'll try and articulate a few thoughts. I'll try and put it together and connect some of the things that I heard just now. We are at a very special time, I think, in the midst of this extraordinary set of circumstances relating to the COVID pandemic. And one thing it has done is made this whole area of social and emotional learning kind of more prominent, more pressing than ever before, right? We've got this situation now where we're kind of recognizing that actually this stuff is really important and it's really, really relevant. I think everyone working in youth settings has always known social and emotional learning is highly relevant, but this has brought it to a new level, I think. And I guess one of the things I want to just reflect on first is who is actually involved in this. One of the slightly artificial dichotomies that you get in work on social and emotional learning is the dichotomy of universal versus targeted or indicated interventions. The idea being that universal social and emotional learning is directed at all children and young people in a setting, whereas targeted or indicated interventions are more focused on particular groups or even individuals who've been identified as needing extra support. And I think in the COVID-19 context, we've kind of come to realize that these two are not sort of mutually exclusive options, but they actually need to coexist and, more importantly, need to be nested one inside the other. They need to be coherent with each other. When we're thinking about well-being, grit, persistence, resilience, character, all of those things, and all the social emotional skills, we now can very clearly articulate how relevant that is to absolutely everybody in the school setting, everybody in a youth setting, and frankly, everybody in the entire community, right? This is not just even about children and young people, this is all of us. And yet at the same time, we know that some children and young people will be facing particular adversities, particular challenges, and are going to need some additional support. But the point here that I want to make is that this is a perfect opportunity for us to kind of recognize that This is not like a different enterprise, that when we're working with a child who's got particular emotional needs or some challenging behaviors, that these are not sort of like aliens, you know, in another category where you kind of put the label on them of difficulties or abnormal or something like that. Actually, this is about all of us. And yes, some children, some young people are going to need to have some extra support. Some people are going to need some very distinctive, intensive interventions as well. But it must be connected to social and emotional learning and well-being support and mental health support for absolutely everybody. So that's the first thing I want to say, that this is really about making sure that what we do for everybody is front and center when it comes to thinking about well-being. Because too often, when I've been in youth settings and schools in particular, quite often social and emotional learning and well-being, mental health, grit, resilience gets sort of parceled off as if it's only relevant for a small category of children who effectively are being othered. They're being marginalized just by that process. And this is a nice opportunity for us to say, actually, you know what, this is for everybody. Bethia, you said in your really lovely presentation just now, the unit of analysis needs attention in terms of how we look at social and emotional learning, and you're talking about the kernels and core ingredients, core components and things like that, which I totally agree with. That's like the unit of analysis with regard to the what, but I'm going to stick with what I just said about the who. What's the unit of analysis with regard to the who? Well, here I think we've got something quite interesting on our hands, and I'm going to stick with the theme of the kind of universal nature of all of this work. I think very often, just like we kind of parcel off social emotional learning to as if it's kind of the properties of a particular group of children who are identified as having difficulties, excuse me, sometimes we make the mistake of also parceling it off with a given individual, thinking that the social and emotional learning, the grit, the character, the persistence, the resilience, motivational qualities, whatever it is that we happen to be looking at, thinking that those are just properties of that one individual child. In other words, the unit of analysis is simply this child or this young person. And I think that's a mistake. And I can talk about my own research here and say that I think these are things that we've got wrong in our research as well, because so often we measure the child. And we need to think in a slightly different way, because I think the unit of analysis is very often not the individual child, as if they're kind of completely in isolation in a vacuum. To me, the unit of analysis is actually the network of relationships within which that child is embedded. Every child is embedded within a network of relationships. And when we want to understand something like resilience, when we want to understand something like social competence, when we want to understand something like emotional literacy, we shouldn't go straight to that individual child's head and treat it as if it's kind of existing just by itself. I think we need to be thinking much more about the network of relationships. So what I would say is, rather than asking, is this child resilient? Does this child have character? Does this child have grit? Does this child have self-regulation competencies? I would say, does the network of relationships within which the child is embedded, does that network of relationships have resilience? Does that network of relationships have grit? Does that network of relationships have self-regulatory capacities? Right? And I think that changes the agenda completely, because it makes us think much more about the ecology within which we're all living. That means also that it's not anymore just about children and young people. It's actually about all of us, the adults as well, in a school setting, everybody in a community. And the school community, of course, is much bigger than just a collection of children and one teacher. There are so many different people who are in the school community. We've got people outside the school gates, all the families in the community, they're all part of it as well. And to really understand what's going on for a child or young person in terms of social emotional skills or grit or resilience, character, What we really need to do is interrogate what's going on for that whole community. And that's why I think, going back to what Aleisha started us off with, talking about not just delivering the program, but also the kind of everyday practices, and we heard it very much from Emma and Bethia as well, the everyday practices that actually cultivate and foster those different skills, the role modeling that adults are doing. I would be saying also, I bet, Emma, thinking about the language point, it's not just the children's language that's changing as well, right? It's also, you've got the adults as well talking in different ways. And the thing that I keep coming back to is that, the school is a workplace. You've got people who are working, and they've got relationships amongst themselves. They've got pressures in their own lives. They've got demands that they're trying to deal with. They're also thinking about, their own career development, the well-being in terms of their own resources that they've got to deal with the stresses that are there in their lives. And all of those things are part of that network of relationships as well. So again, going back to the point that you were saying at the end, Bethia, about opportunities, I really like that point, because actually those opportunities don't come out of nowhere, and they can't simply be engineered. You can't simply just say to a school or any youth setting magically, hey, go and create fantastic opportunities to build those social emotional skills. They kind of have to develop organically as well. And then you ask yourself, okay, what are the structural factors that might be influencing whether those opportunities are being provided or not, or to what extent they're being provided? So to my mind, that simple point about saying the unit of analysis is not just the individual child, it's actually the whole ecology, the set of relationships that the child is part of. I think that changes the entire enterprise, and I think it's something that we need to do. It's really hard. I mean, I can speak for myself doing research in that area. It's really hard to do that kind of research. It's much easier to go and do a questionnaire with a child and get a score and say, that's that person's social and emotional skill or resilience. But I don't think it's right. So I'm just going to end picking up on that questionnaire issue with a point about accountability, because I think that would
just a minute. Yeah. 1 minute, Robin, if you could. Sorry.
Absolutely. So, and here was me saying that I didn't have anything to say as well. So always the worst thing. Anyway, so apologies, but I will just say that I think this raises really, really challenging questions for accountability, and we've had some really great points made about the accountability issue. I think there's an issue here, whether we take an outcomes approach or a process approach. I think there are going to be pros and cons to both of those. They're not going to be perfect measurements, if you like, of whether a given setting is doing a good job of promoting social and emotional skills. I think both need to be there, but we need to have a really good understanding of the advantages and disadvantages of the different evaluation techniques we're using. And as always, I would say, multiple methods, that's the gold standard. The more we can bring multiple methods together, multiple informants, multiple perspectives, the richer the understanding. But I also live in the real world, and I know there's a challenge around how to do that in a very systematic and not too intensive way. So I'm really curious to know whether others here have ideas about that, both the people on the panel and the people listening. But I will stop talking now and just say thank you very much for inviting me to contribute.
Could listen to you forever, Robin, and I hate to have to stop, but you really made me think about the unit of measurement, and I'm reminded of a fabulous quote. It goes, resilience is about relationships, not rugged individualism. And sometimes the whole grit thing, it's all about, it's not that, is it? It's relationships. Wonderful. So I'm now going to go over to the main site and start to look at some questions that may have come up, and I will ask, looking at here's one. I love the idea of kernels, aligning evidence to practice in a personalised way rather than off-the-peg programmes. But how do you demonstrate impact when you're looking at evaluating kernels of good practice rather than programs? So I'll ask Aleisha to come back on that one first.
Sure. As Bethia mentioned, Stephanie Jones in the US is doing some really interesting work on kernels, particularly in relation to cell. And she's actually identified kernels of practice. So instead of, the requirements for implementing bulky, comprehensive interventions, that there are core strategies that we can implement and integrate into our everyday classroom teaching. So very much going back to Emma's example of the turtle technique, that's an example of a kernel that can be used, or the I messages. And I think where we're getting to slowly, I don't think we're there yet, is actually coming up with some evaluation techniques to start to understand the impact of these kernels. So we're doing work at EIF in collaboration with PEDAL, Paul Ramanchandani and his team, in terms of early years education. So looking at kernels within evidence-based interventions as part of cell interventions, and trying to identify what are the core skills and practices used to teach these skills. Can we translate that into something that's very easy to implement for early years practitioners? And then the next big question is, can we look at evaluating the effectiveness of that? And I think one of the things we're starting to think about is perhaps it may be an evaluation around the training that we put in place to support the implementation of these kernels.
Thank you very much indeed. Do you mind, everybody? There's some fantastic questions, so I know others could come back on that, but I'm going to go on to another one, bringing two questions together. It's a question first for Emma, but also for others. It's about the role of parents. So does the whole school, Emma, take a whole community approach and educate parents too who may not have these skills? So an intergenerational gap we could be developing. And also another question asked of how we can support parents to support the work on cell. And then there's also another question about what the panel thinks about the links between cell and family relationships and parental relationships. So I'm going to go to each of the panel and ask if they have comments on parents, the community, families and parental relationships. I'll start with you, Emma.
Yeah, thank you. There's some really good questions there. Yeah, parents, because it goes back to what Robin was saying, doesn't it, about parents and the ecology of the child. I think for us, in terms of parents, I think the thing that's the most powerful is, parent workshops. They historically haven't been the way to infiltrate and communicate with our parents here. What we do is the language that we use with the adults and with the children, we then use when we're talking to parents. So if we're recounting an incident that's happened in school, we will model the paths language to parents. And that feels like the best way to share that information with them, sort of one parent at a time approach. And a really powerful example, one of those year sixes, I talked about at the start, who went in specialist provision, and his mum would just shout at him and would get frustrated with him. And a year down the line, I sat in my office with her saying, I can see that you've got uncomfortable feelings there. And she was, without prompting, was starting to use that language with him. So if we as a school use that language with our parents, and we now hear our parents using it with the children.
And I think we may all be seeing a question at the moment, a poll. So I've answered it, and I hope you will too. And I was going to go on now to Bethia. Would you like to add anything to the whole idea of parents and community and cell?
It can be slightly more tricky in youth services because of course, for some, particularly as young people get older, further into adolescence and young adulthood, their independence grows. Many may be living independently or quasi-independently. So the possibility, and indeed in some cases the ethics of making direct connections into parental relationships becomes a little bit more challenging. That said, I do think that we've just done we did a process evaluation of open access youth provision, so what many of us would understand to be a youth club in a local community, and we picked up on quite quickly the importance of that space in the minds of parents and carers and guardians, in terms of somewhere that young people could go, and where young people were being supported, they were having fun, and they were learning. So opportunities for parents and carers to understand as much as possible what's happening in that setting, I think. But also that the broader community are encouraged to see children and young people as an asset in terms of those networks of relationships, as Robin was saying, that happen in a place. There's also some interesting work going on in the States at the moment, because most places in the States, many people will know, actually schools haven't opened yet. They've been closed since March. So an incredibly extended period of home learning. And there's been quite a lot of work in looking at how we might understand quality relationships with families and home settings in the context of online learning. And that, again, is encouraging the knowledge and the making the connection between children and young people and the context in which they're living, the spaces and the relationships.
Thank you very much, Robin.
Thank you very much. I think one of the things that sometimes happens is that you can get a sort of a blame culture developing, which is really unhelpful in the case of young people who have difficulties, whereby the problem is being located more or less at the door of families, and the challenge around trying to develop a much more collaborative kind of partnership to solve problems is quite a big one. And I think one of the things that comes through from this is that there needs to be quite a concerted effort right from the very beginning, if you like, not waiting for problems to happen before you start to engage parents as partners in that process. But it is difficult, I think, because there's only so much time in the day. People are incredibly busy with lots of different responsibilities. There's lots of different accountabilities that people have as well. But that issue of parents as partners in the educational process, I think, is a really, really important one. I think there probably are structural factors that make a difference to this in terms of whether that is an easier or more difficult task. Some people who you most want to engage very often are not engaged. But I think one of the things that can find a way through here is giving attention to some of the things that maybe are not necessarily the highest or most prominent things within the school setting as well. And one of the places where I've seen some really great successes is in the arts, in the domain of arts, so extracurricular activities basically, where there's an opportunity to connect with parents in new and quite powerful ways. And one of the interesting things we've been doing in relation to the arts is looking at how the creative arts foster new kinds of conversations between families and schools in relation to the social and emotional skills development, because actually there's a tremendous amount of social and emotional skills development that occurs in the creative arts process. And I think probably the same in a lot of other extracurricular activities as well. So finding those kinds of domains which open up conversations which can cultivate that sort of collaborative work around social and emotional skills, I think is so important, because it kind of overcomes that barrier that comes up instantly when it's kind of solve a problem for a given child who's displaying difficult behaviour.
I have seen children who have undertaken cell learning at school go home and demonstrate it I'm touching on the issue now of the couple relationship. And I've seen children go home and demonstrate the steps in conflict resolution, for example, to amazed parents. So there can be some good family learning there. And I've also seen, through my experience of the SEAL programme, there's a part of that is called Family SEAL, workshops where parents do come in and do things with their children, picking up on Robin's point about using the arts and using joint activities, which have been very successfully implemented. We are coming to the end. Somebody asked me to repeat the quote on resilience and say where it came from. The quote was, "Resilience is about relationships, not rugged individualism." And I can't remember where it came from. I'm really sorry, but I bet if you Google it, you'll find out. It was one of those Harvard Center for the Developing Child, or, an American site, but I'm afraid I can't remember. We've only got 2 minutes. just a word, like very short from Robin, how can we measure those cell within a network of relationships or a community as opposed to the individual? A quick idea on how we might be able to, what tools you could use to measure.
Okay, so one of the things that I think is really important is actually to look at the quality of the organizational climate, the community climate as well. And that means picking up on the ethos of the school. And you can ask multiple informants about that. You can ask staff about that. You can ask parents about that. You can ask children about that. And I think that's a really, really good middle ground for actually trying to come up with good indicators of how people are actually experiencing that particular setting. And so I think there's quite rigorous measures out there in terms of social emotional climate and ethos. That's where I would go. But like I said before, this unfortunately isn't going to be a case where you just do one 10-minute questionnaire and you've got your answer to be able to evaluate how good someone's social emotional skills are.
Thank you so much. I see from the poll that we are pretty overwhelmingly agreed that social emotional learning is not being given the right level of priority in schools. So perhaps next year we'll come back together. It would be really good to continue this conversation and talk about how we're going to change that situation together. A huge thank you now to all the panel. I do wish we had 5 hours to talk about this. I've enjoyed it so much, and I hope that those who've posed wonderful questions we haven't been able to get to can live with the frustration of not having them answered. I am so sorry we didn't have time. You are all now asked to take a break and come back at 3:10 to the main conference to hear from the minister. So from all of us, let's give everybody a wave. Bye-bye and enjoy the next session.